Okay, so here we're going to talk about why we argue about abortion and why we seem to never really get anywhere. This is my final project. It is meant to be persuasive, but more than persuasive, it's meant to sort of persuade you not in an opinion, but more of a way of thinking and maybe empathy and coherence, but it's a broader thing than simply this is right. It's kind of dense, but I will do my best to walk you through it. So here's the roadmap. We're going to start with terminology and definitions. We're going to move to the problem itself, my own kind of blend of methodology, a priori, which I think is pretty necessary when dealing with an issue like this. I'm going to talk about who the audience is and why it matters to them. I'm going to talk about a visual aid that I made called the metaphysical staircase. We're going to discuss all of this sort of theory in a real life case and see how it applies. And then I'm going to wrap it up in a nice conclusion. So let's start with our terminology. An axiom, it's commonly used in math and logic, but I think it's very important to use it in philosophy as well. And then, of course, by abstraction, also morality, the law, ethics, which are sort of downstream of that. And so an axiom is a self-evident truth. You can't prove it. And more importantly, or equally as important, you use it as a foundation for other truths. So it's kind of define it as like an indivisible. You can think of it as like the atom, or I suppose what a quark would be. It is indivisible in and of itself, but is the foundation of other stuff, and you can't prove it. The is-ought problem is the extreme difficulty we find ourselves in, possibly impossibility, of deriving moral truths from material ones, which means making objective moral observations from like physical phenomenon. And then we're going to talk about the metaphysical staircase, which is a series of axioms and moral truths that have to be accepted progressively to allow the rigorous ascent of the sort of the next stepping stone, the next following view. And don't worry, we'll cover these more thoroughly when I reach them. So here he is. What's an axiom? I'm defining it 3 times because I'm going to be talking about it a lot. This is the axiom presentation. I mean, this is, if I can have you come away with one thing, it's recognizing how important axioms are to our worldviews and how crucial they are and how under talked about they are. Because oftentimes we talk past each other, and I feel like this is a pretty big reason as to why. So a good example is 1 plus 1 equals 2 is an axiom. You couldn't go into nature and observe 1 plus 1 equals 2. Obviously, if you have one thing and another thing, you could say, I have 2 things, but those characters themselves, one of them, 1 and 1 being 2, is axiomatically defined. Okay, now is the is-ought problem. So why do these axioms even matter? What can we do and not do with them? Well, here's a good example of predicate logic. And again, this is a very sort of sanitized, simple, shallow end of the problem. So I would say, I don't like fruit. That's axiomatic. It's not something you can prove. It's not really something you can observe. I mean, through phenomenon you can, but there isn't an objectively right answer to that. Apples are fruit. This is more subjective, but I mean more objective. It's categorical, I would call it, or contingent. What defines an apple is still not, super objective, but we have criteria. It's taxidermic. So while those criteria can change, at least we have a basis. We can argue about it. And so in this size system, I don't like fruit. Apples are fruit. Therefore, I don't like apples. That is deductive logic. It is unarguable in the sense that it is valid. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion must therefore be true. We have to separate that from a sound argument, which is a valid argument, but the premises are true. Okay? So, super simple. Now I have to define what abortion is. It's the intentional act of ending a pregnancy before term. Pretty simple, but it becomes complicated when you think about sort of the issues that surround it. So why abortion is important? It's super divisive. It's basically split this country 50-50, and while there certainly are times and movements that have more or less affinity towards it, it's not something that seems to be going away in terms of controversy, even outside of sort of religious sentiments, even among secular people. I can't foresee that those people will become pro-life or pro-choice, and I also can't assume that it's going to be resolved. It's very common, despite what you might think or hear. It is there's 73 abortions performed annually per year, and as I'll get to, that's actually increasing. Intent. This is another common misconception. Uh, Intent is not irrelevant. You'll often hear that of these edge cases where a mother is put in this really horrible position, and I have tremendous empathy for those people. But it would also be misrepresenting the data to consider that the norm. Those are actually a pretty high statistical outlier. 95% of abortions are performed electively. What does electively mean? Electively is not means that the conception was not a result of rape, incest, and the pregnancy does not currently or expected to constitute a physical danger to the mother. So 95 could be for saying lifestyle makes it seem sort of biased, but that is the best way of phrasing it. It's for monetary, it is for education, it is for career, which are all valid, but that's what elective means. Polarization, as I said, super polarized. But beyond just being split 50-50, you could say, well, people who like strawberry ice cream versus, raspberry is split 50-50. That doesn't mean it's polarized. Abortion, it causes anger in people, unlike basically any other issue. You'll be really hard-pressed to find one that doesn't just divide people, but agitates them like abortion does. And acceleration. Again, a pretty common misconception, but since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, abortions have actually doubled annually in the United States. And this is often through abortion pills, as you'll see, or medical abortions. Okay, but really, why is it important? Well, it comes down to a pretty big difference, whether or not the fetus is worthy of moral consideration. If it is, it's a huge deal. It means that abortion will be the longest and most devastating genocide in human history. It would have killed more people than the entire Holocaust every year, 6 times over, if they're equivalent to people. If they're not equivalent to people, like, say, an animal or completely write-off, then it's extremely trivial. It makes up an infinitesimally small amount of what our livestock would be. So it would be a non-issue. And this is a big deal. Like, depending on how you think about it, this causes anger, and rightly so. But I feel like we shouldn't just treat it that way. The dialogue I see is not necessarily, or shouldn't necessarily be, between one side who says, you're a murderer, and the other side says, you're an oppressor. It's between people and people. And you already probably have a stance. Chances are it's probably pretty strong, which is fair. There are issues where it should be expected and maybe even normalized to have a strong stance on, because ultimately we're talking about human lives, well-being, and, personhood. And if there was ever an issue that you should feel compelled to speak about, it should be about human well-being. So I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with malice and with sort of this discourse of just this extreme prejudice and anger. So I would ask you to trust reasonable people to act reasonably. Disagreements don't always stem from malice, and keep an open mind. But again, I'm not going to be discussing what's right or wrong objectively. I'll just kind of be walking you through why those arguments often fall apart, and what my claim is, why it's so hard to nail this one down. Like, why hasn't this been solved like other issues, and why I foresee it won't ever really be solved. So this is my thesis. Abortion as an issue exists in a sort of state of perpetual anger and discourse and dialogue that is seemingly never-ending, and it seemingly won't ever end, because the people who engage in it can't meaningfully engage with each other. They talk past each other. They engage on different wavelengths, and the reason for this is that they hold different axioms to be true, different fundamental axioms of truth. And so while this can't really be solved by recognizing this mismatch, we can approach it with more compassion and more understanding, and maybe if we can't further the dialogue itself, we can at least further our understanding of our fellow man. But I foresee that we actually probably can find something a little more transcendent, maybe even dialectical. But we'll get to that when we get to that. So what am I going to try and do? I'm going to walk you through basic ideas and terminology. I've already kind of started doing that. I'm going to evaluate existing arguments and provide food for thought. This isn't going to be, abortion is moral always because this. Those arguments are not only inconclusive, but they also are just not true because, as I'll explain to you, a lot of the reasoning behind those is subjective. Same with, of course, the other stance. What I won't do is take a stance and frame it as objective when it's really dogmatic. That's biased and that's arguing in bad faith. And despite my best efforts, this will not be comprehensive. The scope here is already enormous. It's going to be super long, probably super confusing. It's a fine line between sort of explanation and brevity, and I'm trying to land somewhere where the clarity is as good as I can get it, while still making sure that if you don't know what I'm talking about ahead of time, I'm giving you a fair shot to learn it as I go. That also means I have to inject a lot of stuff along the way. It's a balancing act. And what I can't do, I can't solve this issue quantitatively, obviously. And I also can't meaningfully provide synthesis across these huge sort of axiomatic divides. But I will try, but I can't do it. I don't think anyone can, though. So I'll cut myself a little slack there. Let's talk about the methodology a little. I looked at philosophical essays, book reviews, and contemporary articles. And I focused extensively on a priori reasoning, meaning not evidence based on phenomenon or, statistical data per se, but on more primal, I suppose, truths. And there's a few reasons for this. But the main reason is that evidence just doesn't really work in this case. So I could use stuff like miscarriage rate, the terrible side effects of home-done abortions, or I could say the other way. I could say, when fetal heartbeat or brainwaves start, or how they can react to pain, or what weeks does that happen. Like, there's a lot of issues that no stuff is very commonly used in these sorts of debates. It's a very frequently used rhetoric. But it often doesn't work because it appeals to these kind of subjective domains, right? Like if I asked you if permitting abortion reduced real-world negative outcomes, would that change how it's moral, how it is moral-wise? And you might say, well, yeah, of course. But then I said, if making homicide legal would change its morality, if it reduced real-world negative outcomes, and you would say, well, obviously no. Then what we're really finding is that it isn't the outcomes that determine it, it's this pre-existing notions we have about it, right? There is a discrepancy. It isn't really the fact that real-world outcomes change its morality, but it's sort of a deeper truth. Maybe it's like a little bonus, an added virtue, but it does not determine it. And so I absolutely shy away from using that sort of numeric analysis, and I would encourage you to do the same. But, compare all sides, but just keep in mind that this data will often mislead you because truth should exist outside of data, hopefully. So who's my audience here? Well, I would say everyone. Everyone was a fetus, and now everyone is an adult. So everyone that currently is listening to this has been on both sides of this issue. Which makes everyone uniquely qualified to talk about it. But in a more focused sense, this is for people who want to engage in this sort of rhetoric. People who are not dogmatic about their view on abortion, but rather think, I've heard convincing things from both sides. I can't really reconcile that. Why is that? This is who this is for. This is what that's for. Okay. So how do we decide what is? That's a huge question, and I can't answer it. I can offer some sort of some like basic ideas on how to approach it, scientific realism or truth. Can we know things for certain or not? if I went into this, this would be an hour or two on its own. But we can sort of arrange it in kind of a logical sort of nested statements. So we can say, if we can determine objective truth, absolutely. And then if so, we can determine moral value, absolutely. And then determine Homo sapien, what it means to be Homo sapien, what it means to have personhood, sort of weigh the scales of maternal versus fetal rights. If we can answer all those, then we probably could provide an objective, in heavy quotes, answer to abortion. But that's a lot of ifs. And there's a lot of work along the way. And to assent to these views, I mean this quite literally, we are climbing a mountain here, or a staircase. To assent, I actually think it does have a different route, but whatever. We need to hold progressively more axioms to be true, which is why there's so much divergence, and it's why it's so controversial. So here's a recap. I'm sure you don't need that. You strike me as a very smart person. Okay, but why is philosophy, that important? I probably strike you as someone who is too deep into the weeds here. It can't really be that complicated. Well, it is. And it's at the root of how we strike or manage human agency, how we rationalize it. So I kind of made this little visual aid here on the left as how we delineate ethics. And I believe this is super simplistic, super reduced to the point where it's arguably more reductionist than it is distilled, but it should give you an impression, which is that philosophy sort of governs how we think about things, or how people should think. Legality is how people should act, and morality is how people should feel. Obviously, it's more complicated, much more complicated. But what you'll come to find is that philosophy is a progenitor of legality and morality, and also exists as a much more logically coherent form of it. It's sort of a synthesis or a precursor. That said, because it's so devoid of human institution, it's often hard to swallow. You'll find stuff like the trolley problem, where that is an example of high philosophical clarity and adherence, but when it comes to legal or moral choices, it becomes a lot more gray because it's asking things that we don't like answering. So I'm going to give you some positions that are found in academia. These aren't, traditional ones. These are ones that I found to be most interesting. So David Boonin offers one that fetal personhood is not assured because the fetus lacks a meaningful desire for itself and for its future. And he goes a step farther in saying, even if it did have moral worth, the mother was not responsible to continue care. And that is a very common argument. It's actually been synthesized into the violinist analogy, which argues that imagine you were kidnapped by a gang of, lunatic music enthusiasts. And when you wake up, you're tied to a chair and you are hooked up at like a human dialysis machine to a famous violinist who is in complete renal failure. And they say, this violinist is the best of their craft, a super important person. And they just need a few months of you hooked up, and then they'll be able to get a transplant and recover. And this won't kill you, and their life has value, but you don't get a choice in it. And this argument, the violinist sort of analogy, says that even if this person has value, and even if you're saving their life, and even if it doesn't necessarily come at the cost of your own, as a human being, you're still entitled to withdraw consent, withdraw support. Right? The violinist's life can have value, and yet you can also do something that will kill them as well. So that's him. Marianne Warren's she wrote in a sort of a similar vein, but took a little more neutral stance. And she actually takes a very harsh opposition to that analogy because it implies no consent in it, right? But as I showed you earlier, the vast majority of pregnancies do come from consent, and the vast majority of abortions are carried out not on grounds of non-consent. And so in that example, if you willingly put yourself on a dialysis machine for the violinist, then it's a much more complicated case of if you should be allowed to withdraw support. If you said ahead of time, I'm going to save your life, and then later say, I changed my mind. And she mostly argues that that's not why it's moral to have abortion, but rather because even late stage fetuses demonstrate less behavior than that of animals. And unless you hold people accountable to all animal suffering, even ones that show similar sort of awareness to a fetus, even at late stages, which would be, insects and birds, unless you hold their lives to be paramount too, there isn't a reasonable way you can defend it. Let's look at the other side, some pro-life positions. So Don Marquis argues that abortion is wrong not because of its killing per se, but because the fetus is entitled to a future like the one we have, and that deprivation of a future is the immoral act. That's the violation. And he goes further and says the reason why this is so important is because even people that don't want their futures are still entitled to it. Even those who are depressed or who are comatose or suicidal, who either cannot express a desire for a future or express a desire to not have a future, we still treat their lives as valuable and still consider the act of depriving them of that future to be criminal and, of course, immoral. And Harry Oerster takes a more bioethics approach. He kind of argues from epistemological humility. He says that there really aren't these concrete biomarkers. Could be conception, implantation, neurulation of when life begins. It's gray. And he says, in lieu of a sort of a concrete window, he would just assume that when it comes to human life, just to take the most cautious stance of it imaginable. And that would be, of course, a pro-life stance. Okay, so let's just sort of break this down using the same Apple argument we used further. And again, we're going to be using axioms because I think they're critical to this. So human beings deserve autonomy. That's the axiom. You can't really prove that, but if we assume that, then we can work off of it. Then you would say, in a pro-life argument, this would be a mother's autonomy one. Abortion is an example of bodily autonomy. It is not axiomatic in the same way because we can categorize other examples of autonomy and see if it fits. Right? We see if it's categorically similar. That said, of course, it's still very arguable if it does fit. And if those two are true, then we have to conclude that abortion is true. Abortion is moral. There's no other possibility. Like, this is a deductive argument. It's not necessarily sound because you might or may not agree on the premises. But if we do agree that the premises are true, then we have to conclude that the conclusion is also true. On the flip side, you could say killing persons is immoral. That's an axiom, and probably one you agree with. You could say, well, fetuses are persons. Again, it's arguable. What does it mean to be a person? That's a whole other dialogue. Not relevant to this, but that's at least arguable. And then, just like last time, the conclusion you have to draw is abortion is immoral. So I've just given you two pretty reasonable arguments that draw differing conclusions. And this really goes to show that there isn't, as much as you'll be told that this is a clear-cut issue, that it's super solved, and anyone who doesn't agree with you is either a child murderer or a hardcore misogynist who wants to oppress people. It's not. It is complicated, and it depends on your perspective. That's all well and good, but how does this apply to the real world, right? Like when push comes to shove, how would you apply this to a real case? And there's actually a very interesting one that I thought to apply it to, and that is of Adriana Smith. It's fascinating and, of course, very tragic. I can't help but feel, grief for her and her child. But it also serves as a really important basis for philosophy, bioethics, law, and how that intersects with the greater abortion dialogue as a whole. So, in February, she had a brain clot that left her brain dead. But at the time, she was also pregnant in the very, very early stages of pregnancy. The exact situation and circumstances are complicated. The hospital that she was at for care was afraid that because of Georgia's Life Act, if they did withdraw life support for her, they would be criminally liable. The family was told or felt under the assumption that they were not given the opportunity to withdraw care, even though that was what they had wanted. And the state said that this was all ridiculous and that they could have withdrawn life support at any time. So everyone's saying that everyone lied to them, which is nothing new, but we should move on. So what sets this case apart? She was brain dead. And unlike most cases about abortion that settle on the mother's future, her agency, and harm about her, that becomes a lot more complicated in this situation. So let's assume in this case that we assent to the axiom that abortion is always moral, or the statement that abortion is always moral because it is a matter of a woman's autonomy. Well, she's a woman. She deserves autonomy. Abortion is an expression, a valid expression of that autonomy. So we can say abortion is moral. But it's a little more complicated because regardless of the traditional arguments against abortion, as I've previously mentioned, there are some new ones here. When someone is brain dead, what right do they have towards autonomy? Can dead people be mothers? Can you be a person with no brain or no functioning brain? This is important and not trivial. So, to play devil's advocate here, if we say abortion is moral because it minimizes the suffering of the mother, how does that apply to someone who is incapable of suffering? Or if it is moral because a child could deprive a mother of a future, how does that apply when the mother doesn't have a future? Or if it's moral because the mother is this, intelligent being and we're comparing it to a clump of cells, how does that compare when the clump of cells actually has more neurological activity, because this was, weeks and months in, to then compare to someone who's brain dead? So it's a lot of these arguments about personhood and autonomy are contradicted, or at the very least challenged. But at the same time, because of her helpless state, there is also new arguments for it. But let's just say, assuming that the axioms of harm reduction and prioritization of life are the highest good, then I would argue, considering that, it's actually quite a bit easier to justify keeping her alive. A lot of the news you'll hear about is how this was an especially egregious case of pro-life sentiment. But I would take a completely 180-degree stance on that. I would say that if you can get your head around abortion being illegal, then this is probably the best case scenario for it, where the mother is not harmed, her agency and autonomy is not undermined, and she's not deprived of a future. I mean, this is the best case for that. I'm not saying that abortion should be illegal at all. I'm saying that if we already assent to that, or we are amicable to that idea, this presents it as actually kind of a best case scenario. That said, on the flip side, familial consent and dignity are important too. And in this case, her family felt like they were helpless. And at what level do aesthetics become a component too? I mean, even though dignity is pretty impossible to quantify, at some level, it almost becomes desecration to keep her alive in this state. And I would argue that that's pretty immoral too. So it's complicated. I hope you weren't expecting an answer other than that. It's complicated. It deprived her family of consent and of her a dignified end of life. And it is unreasonable to expect that she probably did wish to be kept in that state for all those many, many months, even though the child inside of her was still very, very early on when she was pronounced brain dead. But that said, I would argue at the same time that no, it wasn't immoral, because a brain dead person can't take precedence over someone who has neurological function and future prospects. I would say it's both. There isn't a clear deciding thing here. And that really is my thesis. It's that there won't be a conclusion, there won't be a deciding sort of blow one side to the other as long as we keep holding these opposing fundamental views. And I'm not saying that we should even mandate or even try and go towards reconciliation. I'm not even sure if that's ideal. What I am saying is that I diagnose this issue socially as sort of incurable, right? As long as this conflict exists, and as long as people believe these different things, we can't out-logic each other. We can't out-convince each other, because we're not even playing the same game here. We're talking at different wavelengths. So how do we move forward? We got to stop treating morals as absolutes. That's a weird thing to say. You might say, well, morals are absolute. And I would say, well, no, they're not. And that, of course, just proves my point, is that what we believe to be right and wrong is in a constant state of flux, and there's disagreement. And if disagreement exists, it can't really be objective. It must exist through consensus or some other means. Secondly, we must recognize axioms as more than just mathematical precursors. We need to see them as instrumental in our politics, our law, our morality, our daily life as a whole. And I would say that's very, very important. And third, and probably most importantly, is to know the limits of our debate. And that is that I strongly encourage people to discuss with each other, to have dialogues, to pursue synthesis, but also not feel like the opposing side is being unnecessarily stubborn if there isn't reconciliation. That isn't just an issue of, who's more headstrong, who will concede first. This isn't a thing of pride. There are these fundamental notions about what does it mean to have self-worth, agency. How are these weighted against each other? Personhood. And if you disagree on those basics, you will never really reach a reconciliation. And that's okay. But it's also worth keeping in mind for future debates. And that is my argument in a nutshell. It's kind of complicated. I apologize if I went too overboard or out of scope, but I thought it was very interesting, and I hope you learned something, and I hope I challenged you to reconsider some of the views you have and come to your own conclusions in a way that's both sort of conceptually ambitious, but also philosophically coherent and rigorous. And thank you for listening.